I am delighted to be here today with Rabbi Sandy Sasso to talk about her new wonderful children's book, Regina Persisted. And we are featuring this book in the Jewish Women's Archive Book Club and are just so glad to have this opportunity to hear from Rabbi Sasso about her experience. Let me give a little introduction. Rabbi Sasso was the first woman rabbi ordained by the Reconstructionist movement in 1974. She is now Rabbi Emerita at Congregation Beth El Tzedek in Indianapolis, and she's also Director of Religion, Spirituality, and the Arts at the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute, and she's co-founder of Women for Change Indiana. She has been an award-winning author of how many books now, Sandy?
It's probably about 18, coming on 20. A few new books are coming out this fall and in 2019 in the spring.
Wonderful. So a very prolific award-winning author whose work has really helped change how people of all ages think about women in the Jewish tradition. And this latest book, Regina Persisted, tells the story of a young Regina Jonas, who was the first woman ordained as a rabbi. She was ordained in Berlin, Germany in 1935. And as I said, it's featured on this year's JWA Book Club list. So we're very excited to help introduce it to the world. So Rabbi Sasso, will you start by telling us just a little bit about how you first encountered the story of Regina Jonas?
I'd be delighted to. So I had not heard about Regina Jonas when I was ordained in 1974. Actually, I didn't hear about her for many years. And then there seemed to be stories circulating that there was a woman ordained as a rabbi in Berlin, but very little was known about her. It wasn't until I was contacted by the Jewish Women's Archives and also the American Jewish Archives to help lead a trip of walking in the footsteps of Regina Jonas that I started doing more reading about her. I read the biography that was written by Rabbi Alicia Klepek. I started looking up more information on the internet, and I discovered this incredible story that had really been lost to the Jewish community and the Jewish public. And that was my first exploration and knowledge of who she was in any depth.
Mm-hmm. And tell us a little bit about the trip. As you mentioned, there was a trip in 2014 that was co-sponsored by the Jewish Women's Archive and American Jewish Archive that brought pioneering American women rabbis and scholars to Europe to both learn about and commemorate Regina Jonas's story. What was your experience on that trip, and how did it influence your understanding of her and your desire to write this book?
Well, it was an amazing trip, very eye-opening. We really did follow in Regina's footsteps. We went to Berlin, we went to the archives there, we actually saw her papers, her documents, her magnificent handwriting. We talked to people who had done research in the area. What's very interesting, it wasn't until the early 1990s that her papers were actually discovered. Once the Berlin Wall fell, many of the archives were open, and there was a professor from Maryland, St. Mary's College, Katharina Kellenbach, who was doing some research about women in religion. And she went to Germany, she's from Germany, and she discovered Regina's papers. And that is really the beginning in the 90s of discovering who this woman was. And then Alicia Klepek, worked with these papers and wrote this amazing biography. And there we were in the very places where Regina Jonas was. We also traveled to Terezin. She was interned in Terezin for 2 years, and she worked there quite extensively with Viktor Frankl. She was a woman the rabbi who greeted many of the people as they came off the trains. And she did a lot of counseling and support as well as teaching. And when we were in Terezin, we saw some of the papers and the titles that she had for the lessons she taught there. And then we had this really powerful ceremony in Theresen in the columbarium where we dedicated a plaque in her memory. And all the first women rabbis in each of their movements had a part in that ceremony, which we helped to create. There was one of the children artists from Theresen who was living and showed us her art, and her children were there playing cello. It was really a very, very powerful event to sort of capture her memory and bring her story to the public. One of the things that happened toward the end of the trip to follow in her footsteps was a gathering of the women saying, you know, what now? What was your experience like? And a lot of us said, well, we don't want this to pass. We want to find a way to let more people know about Regina Jonas. And it was decided to share with congregations around the United States, at least, the opportunity to consider Shabbat Bereshit as a yard site of Regina Jonas, because the assumption is that when, that's probably around the time that she died in Auschwitz in 1944, and we thought we could get a community to honor her memory, and many congregations said Kaddish in her memory at that time. So all this was very powerful to me, and I wanted this story to be known more widely, and I felt a children's book would help that happen, would let a new generation know about what it was like for a woman in the 1930s in Germany to really persist against great odds to become a rabbi.
So tell us a little bit about Regina Jonas's process. What did she face? What were the challenges, and how did she manage to do this incredible thing that no one had achieved at that point?
Well, it was very difficult. It seems clear from the time she was young that she wanted to be a rabbi. Her father felt that women ought to learn Hebrew and engage in Jewish studies, so he taught her brother and her about Judaism. She would go to the synagogue, and the rabbi there was very interested in helping her learn more, because she was one of the students who came all the time, and they used to study together. And then she decided that she wanted to go to the liberal seminary there, the School for the Study of the Science of Judaism. Other women had gone there and were enrolled, but they were enrolled in order to receive a teacher's certificate. She enrolled in order to become a rabbi. She was the only woman wanting to receive the ordination. And she studied there, and in 1930, she had completed her studies successfully, and she was supposed to be able to take an exam that would allow her, if she passed, to become a rabbi. The Talmud professor who had agreed to give her that exam and ordain her died just before she was to take the test. The new Talmud professor, Hanok Albeck, refused to give her the exam because he did not believe women should become rabbis. So she went on to teach, but as the book said, she persisted. She continued to request the opportunity to take the exam, to be ordained, and finally, 5 years later, after she had served the community in many capacities, she was given, Max Dienemann said, you know what, it's time. We need to ordain you. And in 1935, she was given permission to take the test, and she passed. And she became a rabbi. However, that didn't mean the end of the opposition that she faced. There was lots of criticism, lots of people who thought this was a terrible thing and women shouldn't be doing this. She was restricted from speaking on the main pulpit of synagogues. You know, she often could speak, let's say, at Havdalah, do teaching, but she continued, particularly at a very hard time as the Nazis were gaining power in Germany, and ultimately continued that teaching in Theresen.
And in fact, the rise of the Nazis in some ways gave her more opportunity, because as male rabbis were deported, there was a need for more teachers and pastoral leaders. And so she was able to step in some of those cases.
Absolutely. There seemed to be an understanding among the researchers that she had decided not to leave Germany, to stay with her mother, who was older, and to support the community who had no spiritual leadership because people were leaving. However, that's actually not the case. When I was researching this book, I came across a letter from the Israel archives, which was a letter from her to Martin Buber. And she wrote to Martin Buber saying, I am so impressed with your writings and your philosophy. I'm hoping you can help me. I'm hoping you can, the situation in Germany is becoming quite dire. I would like an opportunity for my mother and for myself to come to Israel. Is there any way you can help me do this? I also believe that perhaps as a woman rabbi, I will have more opportunities in Israel, because it is really hard to be a woman rabbi here in Germany. And she says, I think I could teach the new immigrant Jewish community, and she was hoping for those opportunities. Obviously, that did not happen, and we don't have any evidence of a response that Martin Buber gave. It could exist, but we can't find it.
That's fascinating. So then she goes on to serve as a rabbi in Theresen, and ultimately is deported to Auschwitz, where she's murdered. So how do you understand the forgetting of Regina Jonas, right? I mean, there were certainly many people who knew her also perished in the Holocaust, but there were also many who survived, and yet somehow her story did not make it out of the camps.
Yes, that's what fascinated me a great deal, because, Leo Beck knew her because she worked with him, very famous, Reform rabbi. Viktor Frankl, who she worked very closely with in Theresen, never mentioned her. And the professor of Talmud who refused to give her the exam, Hanok Albeck, did make it to Israel and became a very renowned professor of Talmud and expert in Mishnah. And he, never mentioned that experience. So there was a paper written that gave a few reasons why that might have happened. One was that after the war, people, the leaders of the Jewish community, like Leo Beck, wanted to bring people together, and that a woman rabbi was divisive. It would have created dissension in the community. Another was that she wasn't identified with any particular movement. She went to a liberal seminary, but she wasn't exactly Reformed. She was very traditional in her practice, and she certainly wasn't Orthodox, because she said a woman could become a rabbi. So there wasn't a movement who took hold of her story. And I personally think she was a woman, and many of the people didn't really like the idea of women rabbis, and if they let the story die, then maybe nothing would happen. To me, it felt like a double dying. I mean, she was murdered in Auschwitz, and then her story was killed, and we buried her story. And that's why I felt so strongly that we needed to give her some kind of voice that would continue to inspire people for generations yet to come.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. It was an amazing experience to see on the trip in 2014, these rabbis, these pioneering women rabbis, discovering that you weren't the first, right? That there was a kind of foremother and a predecessor, and how powerful it is to learn about that. To be able to reclaim that piece of history does make us think differently also about what it is to be a rabbi in the late 20th and early 21st century too.
No, absolutely. And, Europe and Germany in particular felt very proud. You know, they felt, wow, this wasn't America that did allowed women to become a rabbi first. We did, and there is a burgeoning Jewish German feminism there. And I met with many of the women who had come together as Jewish feminists in Germany, and this really meant a great deal to them. And also looking at some of her papers, they're really quite striking. I mean, she had a certain optimism at a very difficult time. She still, you know, believed in the good of human beings. She wrote about how gender should not be an issue in the rabbinate, and how, you know, men and women should be given equal opportunities. And this is quite extraordinary. And, you know, we need to know this. We really need to know this.
So as you were conceptualizing your book and researching it, I mean, what was the research process like for you, and how did you think about the way to present this story to a young audience? Because it's not an easy story to tell for children.
No, it isn't an easy story. And like at first I sort of just wrote kind of a history, you know, telling what she did when, and I submitted it to the publisher, who said, this is a very nice, you know, summary of her life, but she has no personality. You know, you need to develop her character. And I'm going, I don't know, is this really possible? We don't have a lot of information. So I went back and I read with a very fine-tooth comb Alicia Klepek's biography, and I looked for things that I normally would not look for. You know, I looked for what she wore, her demeanor. Was she late to class? You know, did she rush? Was she disheveled? Did she speak against people who spoke against her? And I started to look for things that told me what kind of person she was. And I also read a number of articles, and we were able to find some comments that people said about her. And that's what I tried to capture, was something of her personality. I was also able to read a few of the love letters that Rabbi Norden, who lived, I believe, in Frankfurt, had written to her. They had somewhat of a love affair, a sort of spring, fall love affair that ultimately never was consummated because of, you know, both Rabbi Norden and Rabbi Jonas being sent to Dresden and ultimately being killed. But I looked at the love letters for something about who she was and her personality, and that helped me look at the story in a different way and try to see what kind of person was she. How did she relate to people? How did she relate to children? Those kinds of, I looked for that very much in order to create a personality.
Mm-hmm. Well, it comes through beautifully, and the artwork also is so just lovely and sensitively rendered, and kind of helps build up a sense of her as a person.
So we really worked very hard to make sure the art was historically accurate. You know, I too, when I described what the streets looked like, and, you know, what a market might look like, and what the children might dress like, did a lot of research in what was Germany like in the 1930s in terms of the streets, and were there cars, were there horse and buggies, you know, was a big open marketplace, so that we were really accurate to the times.
Mm-hmm. What do you hope your readers will take away from Regina Persisted?
Well, I think the title says a lot, that there are times when circumstances do not support what we believe we should be doing, do not support our dreams. And it is essential to persist, to have the courage to continue trying to fulfill your dream. And she did this against great odds. So that's one thing. But the second thing too is how important it is not to lose stories, how important it is not to let the voices of powerful individuals, creative individuals, go silent. And that has happened to so many women, that their stories, their voices, even their names have really been lost to history. So this is an example of why we need those voices out there. And it's also important for our generation to be sure we tell our own stories, not to undervalue them, to recognize that those stories are important, they have something to contribute. But even in creating this story, I mean, there was so much resonance with me. For example, when people were criticizing her, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, you know, some 30, 40 years later, I heard the same criticism. It was like, well, you know, and if I had known that, that would have been very helpful. Because I had this criticism and I wasn't sure how to respond. I mean, I had to learn how to respond. To have had another story where this was going on, that would have been very empowering, because when you're kind of one of very few, you yearn for a community that understands you. And I think if I had known this, that would have been helpful. So I see this as helpful to a new generation, many who are still trying to fulfill dreams against great odds.
Yeah, we often at JWA say that if you can see it, you can be it. And that's not to say that there aren't pioneers who are the first who become something without having a model of what it could be. But it is so much easier when you know that it's already possible. And when you think of for how many decades or centuries, really, things have been shut down by saying, oh, women can't do that, or women have never done that, so therefore they must not be able to do that. And then when you're able to reclaim different models, and as you're saying, understand, you know, have a sense of camaraderie across the ages, and it depersonalizes it. So you know that whatever criticisms you're facing aren't about you, they're about the challenges that people face in trying to make change. And being able to kind of take some solace in that and have a sense of support across time, I think, is so important.
Well, you know, when I started considering the rabbinate, there were many moments where I said to myself, I shouldn't do this. I mean, no women have done this. I mean, what makes me think that I'm the person that should consider doing this? So, you know, many women said, I never thought I had permission. You know, I never saw a woman rabbi. I love Judaism, but, you know, I just didn't think it was a possibility. So seeing models out there of, you know, women becoming rabbis and functioning as rabbis opens up a door for people who thought it was closed. And I think that's so important.
Absolutely. And that's really what our work at the Jewish Women's Archive is all about, to make sure that people understand that there's been such a broad range of stories that are part of Jewish history and part of Jewish experience that haven't been told, and that haven't been kind of internalized as part of the Jewish story. And we're so delighted to have this as another piece of that telling.
So there's something that happened that was a great surprise to me that may interest you. Do you have a minute for that?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I was finished the book for all intents and purposes, and it went to the publisher and they were formatting to go printing. And I called a colleague of mine, Amy Small, a rabbi, and we're good friends. And I said to her, oh, right now I'm working on this book on Regina Jonas. And she says to me, I have a picture of her. And I said, that's impossible, because there's only one picture of her. All the archives believe there's only one picture of her. It's a picture of her in her long black robe upon ordination. And she says, no, I have another picture of her. She said some years ago, a gentleman came to one of my study classes. And after the class, he came over to me and said, I have a picture in my possession that I want to give to you. You are the first woman rabbi I have met, and I have been carrying this picture with me for years. When I was 13 years old, I met Rabbi Regina Jonas, And I knew this was special. So as a 13-year-old, I asked her if I would have permission to take her photo. And she gave it to me, and I took her photo. And fortunately, I was able to leave Germany, and I took her photo with me. And I have been carrying it for years. And I know you are the person that I need to give it to.
Mm.
And so I said, I was like flabbergasted. I'm going, oh, I want to see this picture, because we have a very stern picture of her, you know, in a formal pose. And she was gracious enough to send me a copy. And, you know, she's in a white blouse, sort of outside on her patio. And I was able to get the publisher to print in the back of the book, in the afterwards, her picture. And this is the first time it's ever been seen. So it was really amazing. As you continue to research the story, you keep finding information, even photos that pop up. It was such, I mean, it was so, all of this was so surprising, and it was a great adventure in discovery, as though we keep peeling back the layers of her story and learning more and more about her. And I just, that was incredible to me. I felt like she was really coming alive.
Yeah, I mean, coming alive and speaking to you practically. It's an amazing story. And it's also a really beautiful metaphor, I think, for how history is transmitted, right? We all have stories that we carry around with us until we find the right person to share them with. And part of the work that we're trying to do is give people more of those opportunities to share those stories, so that they don't die off with people, so that we make sure they become more accessible and more better known and integrated into the way that we talk about Jewish women's stories and Jewish stories in general, and women's stories in general.
I agree with you. No, I used one of your questionnaires to ask my mother, when she was living, a series of questions about, you know, what happened during the war. And without those questions, she would never have told me some of the stories of her life that I learned. And, you know, that was just so powerful to me. I said, I had no idea. I had no idea that that was part of your life. And it really said something about women that I had not known. She said, for example, like during the war, she worked because everybody was off in war. And when all the men came back, they said, we don't need you anymore.
Right.
And I think she was disappointed. And, you know, I had never heard that from her. And that was powerful. So the questions are really essential. And that's what I was doing in the story, asking questions about her and what she was like. She was actually very good preacher. It seems to me that people, what I read was that people just flocked to hear her talk. And that she was particularly good with children, girls especially, to help them become more attached to Judaism. I mean, there's some stories of connections of her with parents of girls and trying to encourage them to continue their Jewish studies even at a difficult time. So she must have been quite persuasive and charismatic in order to receive such accolades from people.
Well, I think that your book will make that accessible to a new generation, and we're just delighted to be able to feature it. Do you want to hold it up so that everybody can
see? I'd love to.
Cover. And for those of you who are interested in learning more about Regina Jonas's story, we also at jwa.org/rabbis have a great deal of material about her, including a link to our short documentary about the trip that Rabbi Sasso went on and mentioned, and a program guide that goes along with that, and many other reflections on her story and on that experience. And this will join the pantheon and really bring it to a whole new generation, and I think help young people make that very important connection that there's so much to learn from Regina Jonas's story about Jewish history and about women in the rabbinate, but also just about how we pursue our dreams and how we cultivate resilience and bring, you know, a sense of strength into the world. I find her story quite moving and inspiring, and a reminder of all the things that you said so beautifully about, you know, the ways that when we lose a story, it's like another kind of losing of a life, and the responsibility we have to ask questions to make sure that those stories get told. And as you plug, JWA has many resources for that at jwa.org/stories. We have our story collecting resources, all kinds of questions and prompts, and ways for you to share stories with us as well. So thank you so much.
So I really appreciate, can I make one more comment? So the story ends with her actual ordination and her work. Then there is a afterwards that says what happens to her. So I wanted to focus on her fight to become a woman rabbi and the struggle she had. The struggles in Theresian and in Auschwitz, well, she was killed immediately on arriving in Auschwitz, are back material to this story. And it also includes the ordination information of each of the first women in the United States who were ordained from each movement. So it does give you some historical background, but this is a story about her struggle to enter the rabbinate.
Great. Thank you so much, Rabbi Sasso. We're really grateful to you for writing this book and for speaking with us today.
Thank you for having me.